A simple phone call from a child was enough to break the heart of the coldest billionaire in Manhattan and reveal the silent struggle of a forgotten waitress. This is the story of Alexander Blackstone, a billionaire who believed money was everything, and Jessica Miller, the waitress who tried to survive on a few dollars while supporting her family alone. Two completely different worlds, united by a phone call that revealed a simple truth: when pride collapses, humanity can be reborn. But tell the truth, do you believe that a simple call can change the destiny of a man used to feeling nothing? Write in the comments what you would do if you were in his place. Like every great story, this one also began on an ordinary day, in a glass office high above Manhattan. There was Alexander Blackstone, adjusting his Italian tie as he watched the city wake up, not imagining that his life was about to spin out of control. At 45, he had built a gastronomic empire that stretched along the entire East Coast, 15 fine dining restaurants serving the American elite. Each dish cost more than many families spent on an entire week of groceries. But to billionaire Alexander, numbers were just numbers. People were just variables in a profit equation. His secretary, Margaret, knocked on the mahogany door. "Mr. Blackstone, the weekly restaurant report." He didn't even lift his eyes from the laptop. "Put it on the desk and leave." Margaret hesitated. She had worked for him for 8 years and knew every nuance of his coldness, but today something troubled her. "Sir, there's an issue at Le Petit Jardin." "I said leave." His voice cut through the air like a blade. She left in silence, leaving only the sound of keys being pressed with unnecessary force. Alexander Blackstone did not tolerate interruptions, did not tolerate excuses, and definitely did not tolerate employees who failed to fulfill their duties. He opened the report from Le Petit Jardin, his most profitable restaurant on the Upper East Side. Everything seemed perfect: revenue was up, reviews favorable, reservations booked for the next 2 months. Then his eyes stopped on a single line that made his eyebrows furrow. Employee Jessica Miller, absent for 2 consecutive days without justification. Alexander felt the familiar wave of irritation rise in his chest. Jessica Miller. He couldn't even remember the waitress's face, but he remembered the name on the employee roster: waitress, night shift. Just another disposable piece in his money-making machine. He picked up the phone and dialed James, manager of Le Petit Jardin. "James, I want you to fire that waitress immediately." Jessica Miller. 2 days absent is unacceptable. "Mr. Blackstone, I tried to call her, but..." "I don't care. Fire her today. And find a replacement by tomorrow. I don't pay employees to be absent." "Sir, may I suggest that..." The billionaire hung up the phone forcefully. 20 years building this empire, and he still had to deal with managers who didn't understand basic discipline. He hadn't gotten where he was by being understanding with irresponsible employees. He stood up and walked to the window. Below, hundreds of people rushed along the sidewalks like ants. Each with their little problems, their little lives, their little excuses. He had risen above it all. He had become untouchable. But deep down, when he returned to his empty apartment every night, Alexander felt a silence that even millions could not fill. Still, he preferred to ignore that feeling. But as he watched the movement of the city, something bothered him. The image of Margaret hesitating at the door. The hesitation in James's voice. As if there was something he didn't know about this Jessica Miller. Alexander returned to the desk and opened the employee file on the computer. He quickly found her record: Jessica Miller, 34 years old, born in the Bronx, waitress at Le Petit Jardin for 3 years. Address: Apartment 4B, 1247, Washington Avenue. Emergency contact: Tyler Miller, 8 years old, son. Son. The word hung in his mind for a moment, but he quickly pushed it away. It wasn't his problem if she had a family. Business was business. He picked up the phone again and dialed James directly. "Change of plans. I'll call this Jessica Miller myself. I want her to hear personally why she's being fired." Mr. Blackstone, I really think that. James, are you questioning my decision? No, sir. I just think you should know that. Alexander hung up before James could finish the sentence. Some managers never learn when to stay quiet. He typed Jessica Miller's number into his personal cell phone. He rarely called low-level employees directly, but today he felt the need to make a very clear point. Maybe other employees would hear the story and understand that Alexander Blackstone did not tolerate lack of commitment. The phone rang once. Twice. 3 times. On the 4th ring, someone answered. Hello? The voice was small, fragile, clearly a child's. Alexander frowned. Surely he had dialed the wrong number. I want to speak to Jessica Miller. Mommy can't talk right now, said the child's voice, trying to sound older than it really was. She's very sick. For a moment, Alexander felt something strange in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced in years. Who are you? I'm Tyler. Her son. 8 years old, Alexander remembered, looking again at the file. 8 years old and answering the phone because his mother was sick. He shook his head. It wasn't his problem. Tyler, tell your mother she's fired. She lost her job for not showing up to work. On the other end of the line, Alexander could hear the muffled sound of a child trying to process what he had just heard. The silence stretched for several seconds, heavy as lead. Alexander was about to hang up when he heard the boy's trembling breath, followed by a question that came out as a whisper. Sir, what are we going to do now? For the first time in 20 years, Alexander Blackstone was speechless. There was something in that child's voice, not anger, not pleading, just the genuine fear of an 8-year-old boy trying to understand how he and his sick mother would survive. And for the first time in decades, Alexander felt something he had buried so deep he had almost forgotten it existed, remorse. 3 floors below, in the small apartment 4B on Washington Avenue, Tyler Miller clutched the phone with his 2 small hands. At 8 years old, he had already learned that some conversations could change everything. Tyler, tell your mother she's fired. He looked toward the bedroom where Jessica had been lying with a high fever for 3 days. The medicine had run out yesterday. The milk in the fridge was enough for just one more morning. Tyler had grown up far too quickly. When his father abandoned them 2 years earlier, he had become responsible for things children should never know: bills, worries, and the constant question of how they would survive until the end of the month. Sir, Tyler said, his voice firm despite the situation. My mother didn't miss work because she wanted to. She's been sick for 3 days and can barely get out of bed. On the other end of the line, Alexander frowned. That wasn't the answer he had expected. There was a pause. Alexander could hear the muffled sound of someone coughing in the background. Then, with the brutal honesty that only exists in the voice of a child facing reality, Tyler said, "We need money." The 4 words fell like stones in the silence of the luxury office. They were not spoken as a plea. They were spoken as a simple and devastating fact. Alexander Blackstone, used to controlling every situation, was completely silent for several seconds. Something in that child's voice, the forced maturity, the acceptance of responsibility, the simplicity of need, had struck a part of him that had been buried long ago. What's the address? Alexander asked abruptly. Tyler hesitated, surprised. Sir? The address. Where do you live? 1247 Washington Avenue, apartment 4B, but why do you want to know? Alexander didn't answer immediately. He himself didn't know exactly why he was asking. He only knew that, for the first time in decades, he couldn't simply hang up the phone and forget the conversation had happened. I need to see the situation personally, Alexander said, more to himself than to Tyler. He hung up before the boy could reply. Alexander remained seated in his leather chair, staring at the phone as if it were an alien object. In 20 years of running an empire, he had never once personally visited an employee's home. He had never cared about their personal stories. But there was something in that voice. Something in those 4 words he couldn't get out of his head. We need money. For the first time, Alexander Blackstone was about to step out of his ivory tower to discover what the real world of his employees was like. Jessica Miller woke up every day at 5:30 a.m. Even on her days off, her internal clock would not let her rest. First, she prepared Tyler's breakfast. Then, she organized the small house, checked if her son's school uniform was clean and if he had finished his homework. At Le Petit Jardin, Jessica was known for her punctuality and attention to detail. She served with a genuine smile, never forced, because she found satisfaction in doing her job well. At 34 years old, Jessica had built a simple but organized life. She paid bills on time, saved pennies to buy quality school supplies for Tyler, and always set aside a few dollars for emergencies, even if emergency meant needing to buy medicine or fix a worn-out shoe. "Mom, why do you never buy anything for yourself?" Tyler would ask. "Because my greatest gift is seeing you smile with what you have, son," she replied. She never spoke of difficulties with Tyler. When money was tight, she simply said she was on a diet or that she wasn't very hungry anyway. When she couldn't buy him something he wanted, she patiently explained about priorities and responsibilities, always turning difficult lessons into moments of learning. The waitress had a secret dream she had never told anyone: she wanted to study nursing. She had kept a pamphlet for a technical course in the dresser drawer for 2 years, but every time she managed to save a little money, something more urgent came up. She didn't see it as a sacrifice, she saw it as responsibility. Jessica Miller was the kind of person who returned change when the cashier gave her too much, who helped elderly neighbors with groceries even when she was tired, and who never missed a commitment she had made. She understood that dignity had no price and that honest work, no matter how simple, deserved to be done with pride. It was this woman who was now lying in bed with a fever in apartment 4B, unaware that in just a few minutes her life was about to change forever. On the other side of town was billionaire Alexander Blackstone, who had never driven his own car. For 15 years, private drivers had taken him wherever he needed to go, while he sat in the back seat answering emails on his tablet or making important calls. But today, something made him dismiss Robert, his driver, and take the keys to the black Mercedes kept in the private garage of his corporate building. He drove through the streets of Manhattan like a tourist in his own city. When was the last time he had really paid attention to the buildings, the people on the sidewalks, the small shops that made up the real life of the city? Alexander realized, with a pang of discomfort, that he had become completely disconnected from the world beyond his offices and luxury restaurants. Washington Avenue was only 20 minutes from his office, but it might as well have been another planet. The buildings were low, of red brick worn by time and soot. Some windows had old air conditioners hanging precariously, others were covered with plastic tarps to keep out the cold. Children played on the sidewalks while their mothers talked on the building steps, and Alexander noticed how everything there seemed real. Genuine. Different from the polished and artificial world he lived in. He parked in front of number 1247 and remained sitting in the car for several minutes, observing. Alexander realized he was nervous. When was the last time he had felt nervous about anything? He stepped out of the car and immediately felt out of place. His $3,000 Italian suit, his handmade leather shoes, his watch worth more than many people earned in a year, all of it made him a stranger in that environment. Some people looked at him with curiosity, others with suspicion. The building lobby was small and simple. The walls needed a new coat of paint, but everything was clean. Alexander climbed the 3 flights of stairs to the 4th floor, his footsteps echoing in the quiet hallway. Apartment 4B. He stopped in front of the plain wooden door, with paint slightly peeling at the edges. There was no electronic doorbell, just a small plastic button beside the door. For a moment, Alexander hesitated. What exactly was he doing there? What was he going to say? He pressed the bell and heard the muffled sound of small footsteps on the other side. The door opened, revealing Tyler Miller. In person, the boy looked even younger than his voice had suggested over the phone. Messy brown hair, large eyes far too serious for his age, wearing a t-shirt slightly too big and jeans with a small patch on the knee. "Are you the man who called?" Tyler asked, looking up to meet Alexander's gaze. "Yes. I'm Alexander Blackstone." He crouched down to meet the boy's eyes, a gesture that surprised even himself. "How is your mother?" "She still has a fever. I tried to give her the last of the medicine, but," Tyler paused, as if he didn't want to admit that the medicine had run out. Alexander looked over Tyler's shoulder and saw the inside of the small apartment. It was modest but organized. A worn sofa, yet clean. A small dining table with 2 chairs. An old television on top of a wooden dresser. The walls held a few pictures, Tyler at different ages, Jessica smiling in her work uniform, some children's drawings that Tyler had clearly made at school. But what Alexander didn't know was that, in that simple apartment, he would find something that billions of dollars could never buy. "Do you know what it was?" In his first impression of Jessica Miller's apartment, what struck Alexander most was the sense of home. Despite the simplicity, despite the obvious financial limitations, there was something in that small space that his 500 square meter luxury apartment had never had: human warmth. "May I come in?" Alexander asked gently. Tyler hesitated for a second, then nodded and opened the door. "She's in the bedroom," Tyler said, pointing to a half-open door at the end of the small hallway. Alexander walked slowly toward the bedroom, each step taking him deeper into a world he had never truly considered before. The room was small, with a simple double bed, a plywood wardrobe, and a single window letting in the afternoon light. Jessica Miller lay in bed, covered with a thin blanket. Even sick, Alexander could see that she had tried to tidy herself. Her hair was neatly tied back, and she wore a clean nightgown. She opened her eyes when she heard footsteps, and for a moment she seemed confused. "Mom," Tyler said softly, "this is Mr. Blackstone, the boss of the restaurant." Jessica tried to sit up in bed, clearly embarrassed at being seen in such a state by her employer. Her eyes filled with worry, not for herself, Alexander noticed, but for what her absence from work might mean for Tyler. "Mr. Blackstone," she said, her voice hoarse from fever. I'm sorry for not going to work. I know there's no excuse, but..." "No," Alexander interrupted, his own voice coming out gentler than he intended. "Don't apologize." He looked around the small room, then at Tyler standing in the doorway, and finally at Jessica, who was staring back at him with a mixture of fear and hope. And in that moment, Alexander Blackstone understood something he had never realized in his 45 years of life. He had spent decades accumulating power and wealth, but had never experienced what it truly meant to be responsible for another person. He had never felt the weight of knowing that his choices determined whether someone had food on the table or a roof over their head. These people, this sick woman and this brave child, depended on him in a way he had never fully understood before. And for the first time in his life, Alexander felt truly responsible for another human being. Alexander stood in the room for several seconds, absorbing the reality unfolding before him. The entire apartment could fit inside his closet. Jessica's monthly salary was equal to what he spent on a single meal in his most expensive restaurants. And yet, there was something there that his world of luxury had never possessed: real purpose. "Tyler," he said, turning to the boy who was watching everything intently. "Where is the nearest pharmacy?" Tyler blinked, surprised. 2 blocks from here, sir. On the corner with Baker Street." "But..." "Get your jacket. We're going to buy medicine for your mother." Jessica tried to sit up in bed, alarmed. "Mr. Blackstone, I can't accept that you..." "You can and you will," Alexander said, but not with his usual cold authority. There was something different in his voice, a gentle firmness he hadn't known he possessed. "Tyler, also take a list of everything you need." 15 minutes later, Alexander Blackstone was walking down Washington Avenue beside an 8-year-old boy, carrying a pharmacy bag that had cost more than Jessica's weekly salary. Tyler walked at his side, occasionally glancing up as if he still couldn't believe what was happening. "Mr. Blackstone," Tyler said when they stopped in front of a small grocery store. "Why are you doing this?" Alexander stopped walking. It was a simple question, but it cut straight to the core of something he himself couldn't fully explain. Why was he doing this? 24 hours earlier, he would have fired Jessica without a second thought. "I don't know," Alexander answered honestly. "Maybe because I forgot what it means to be human." Tyler looked at him with that strange seriousness children who grow up too fast often develop. "My mom always says that being human is the only thing that really matters." Alexander felt something tighten in his chest. When was the last time someone had given him such a simple and devastating life lesson? In the store, Tyler guided Alexander through the narrow aisles with the efficiency of someone who knew every price by heart. He picked only the essentials: milk, bread, eggs, a few cheap canned goods. Alexander watched as the boy calculated each item mentally, putting things back on the shelf whenever the total crossed an invisible limit. "Tyler," Alexander said softly, "get what you need. All of it. But you already spent so much on the medicine." "Get what you need," Alexander repeated, this time more firmly. For the first time since they had met, Tyler smiled, a genuine child smile that momentarily made Alexander forget the complicated adult world around them. When they returned to the apartment, their arms full of bags, Jessica was sitting on the edge of the bed, visibly better after taking the first fever medicine. She looked at the groceries with an expression Alexander couldn't quite decipher, gratitude mixed with something that looked like embarrassment. "I will pay it back," she said immediately. "Every cent. I can work extra hours, or—" "Jessica." Alexander said her name for the first time, and noticed how different it sounded when it wasn't just the waitress from the fourth floor. "You will not pay anything back." She looked at him, confused. "But I can't just accept." "You've worked for me for 3 years," Alexander said, sitting in the small chair beside the bed. The chair was far too simple for his expensive suit, but he didn't care. 3 years serving my clients with dedication, never missing a day, always doing your job the best way possible. And I never knew your name until today." Jessica remained silent, absorbing his words. "I never knew you had a son. I never asked about your family, your needs, your dreams. I treated you like a number on a spreadsheet." Alexander paused, looking around the small apartment that was becoming more familiar by the minute. "You have a brilliant, courageous son who answered the phone today and taught me more about responsibility in 5 minutes than I've learned in 20 years of running companies." Tyler, who was organizing the groceries in the small kitchen, stopped to listen. "So," Alexander continued, "you will not pay anything back. In fact, I am the one who owes you a debt of 3 years of indifference." Jessica looked at him with tears forming in her eyes. "Mr. Blackstone." "Alexander," he gently corrected. "My name is Alexander." In that moment, in the small apartment on Washington Avenue, surrounded by the smell of medicine and simple food, Alexander Blackstone experienced something he had never felt in his luxury Manhattan apartment. He felt at home. Not because the place was comfortable, it wasn't. Not because it had everything he needed, it didn't. But because, for the first time in decades, he was in a place where people cared for each other not for what they had, but for who they were. "Tyler," Alexander said, standing up from the chair. "In a few days, when your mother is better, I would like to talk with both of you about some changes." "What kind of changes?" Jessica asked, her voice still hoarse but full of curiosity. Alexander smiled and realized it was the first genuine smile he had given in years. The kind of changes that should have happened a long time ago. When Alexander left the apartment that afternoon, he was no longer the same man who had entered. Something fundamental had shifted in his perspective, as if someone had adjusted the focus of a lens that had been blurred for decades. Driving back to Manhattan, he didn't think about the emails piling up in his inbox or the missed meetings. He thought about Tyler organizing groceries with mathematical precision. He thought about Jessica apologizing for being sick when she should have been cared for. He thought about the quiet dignity of people who fought every day just to survive. And he thought about how many other Jessica Millers worked for him, invisible behind uniforms and employee numbers, each with their own stories, their own struggles, their own brave children. Alexander Blackstone was about to discover that some revolutions begin not with grand gestures, but with small acts of humanity in small apartments, where children teach billionaires what it really means to be rich. The next morning, Alexander arrived at the office at 6 a.m., 2 hours earlier than usual. But this time it wasn't to review financial reports or plan expansions. It was to do something he had never done in 20 years of his career: truly get to know the people who worked for him. He began by asking Margaret to bring all the employee files from his 15 restaurants. 543 people worked directly or indirectly for Alexander Blackstone. 543 stories he had completely ignored. Each file was a life. Each life, a responsibility Alexander had neglected. At 8:30, he called James, manager of Le Petit Jardin. "James, I want you to organize a meeting with all the employees today at 2 p.m. Everyone, cooks, waiters, cleaning staff, everyone. Mr. Blackstone, this is unusual." "May I ask the reason?" "Changes, James. Changes that should have happened a long time ago." Alexander spent the morning making calls that would completely transform the structure of his companies. First, he contacted his chief accountant and said he wanted to implement a complete healthcare program for all employees, not just managers. He made it clear that he wanted to create an emergency fund for situations like the one Jessica Miller was facing. Next, he called the director of human resources. He explained that he wanted to establish a scholarship program for employees' children and create a system that allowed them to attend technical or university courses with flexible schedules, without risking their jobs. But the most important changes were not in the systems, they were in the man who was creating them. At 2 p.m., Alexander walked into the main hall of Le Petit Jardin and found all 23 employees gathered. Many looked nervous, others curious. Jessica was there, still pale but standing, wearing her neatly pressed uniform. Tyler had come straight from school and was sitting in a chair at the back, watching everything with his serious eyes. Alexander had never given a speech to operational-level employees. He had always delegated that to managers. But today, he needed to speak to them directly. "My name is Alexander Blackstone," he began, and realized the irony, introducing himself to people who had worked for him for years. "I own this restaurant and 14 others in New York. And until yesterday, I didn't know any of you." Low murmurs spread through the group. "Until yesterday, you were numbers to me. Operating costs. Variables in profit and loss spreadsheets." Alexander paused, looking at each face. "Today I discovered that you are the only real thing in this business." Jessica watched him with an expression that mixed surprise and something that looked like cautious hope. "Jessica Miller," Alexander said, looking directly at her, "has worked here for 3 years. She has never missed a day, treats every customer with genuine respect, and raises a son who, at 8 years old, has more integrity than many adults I know. Until yesterday, I didn't even know her name." The silence in the restaurant was absolute. All of that changes today. Alexander then announced the changes: full healthcare coverage, an education program, an emergency fund, profit sharing, and something none of the employees expected: he would personally visit each restaurant once a month, not to inspect, but to get to know the people who made his success possible. "But the most important change," Alexander continued, "is not in policies or benefits. It's in the recognition that you don't work for me, we work together." When the meeting ended, many employees came up to Alexander, some with tears in their eyes, others with disbelieving smiles. But Jessica was the last to stay. "Mr. Blackstone." "Alexander," she said, correcting herself. "Why? What really changed?" Alexander looked at Tyler, who was putting away some drawings he had made during the meeting. A child reminded me that we need the money isn't just about money. It's about dignity. It's about having the chance to dream. It's about knowing that someone cares if you exist. Jessica nodded slowly, understanding. Tyler taught me that real responsibility isn't about having power over people, it's about using that power to lift them up. That night, Alexander didn't return to his empty luxury apartment. Instead, he had dinner at the small table of apartment 4B, eating homemade lasagna that Jessica had prepared, with ingredients he had bought, but which she had turned into something special, listening to Tyler talk about his day at school, and, for the first time in decades, experiencing what it meant to be part of a family. Alexander, Tyler said as he helped wash the dishes, do you think rich people and poor people can really be friends? Alexander paused, reflecting on the depth of the question. I think good people can truly be friends, Tyler. And being good has nothing to do with how much money you have. Tyler smiled. My mom always said that. She said you only discover who you really are when everything else is taken away from you. Alexander looked at Jessica, who was drying a simple plate with a patched dish towel, and realized she was the richest person he had ever met. That night, as he drove back to Manhattan, Alexander Blackstone didn't feel like a billionaire returning to his empire. He felt like a man who had finally discovered what it meant to live a life worth living. The structural changes in his companies were important, but the deepest change had taken place within himself. He had learned that true success was not measured in dollars accumulated, but in lives touched. Not in properties owned, but in relationships built. And it had all begun with 4 simple words from a child who still believed the world had more good people than bad. Maybe he was right. 1 year later, Alexander was sitting at his desk, the same desk where, a year earlier, he had decided to fire a woman whose name he didn't even know. But now he had discovered that true wealth was not in how much you possessed, but in how many lives you lifted and in the opportunities you created for others to write their own success stories. The empire he had built with coldness and indifference had transformed into something much greater, a community. A place where people didn't just work, but grew. Where they didn't just earn wages, but built futures. And it had all begun with the courageous voice of a child who believed that there were still good people in the world. The true measure of a man is not in what he accumulates, but in what he sows. Sometimes the most powerful transformation begins with the simplest gesture, truly seeing the person in front of you. Asking a name. Listening to a story. Recognizing that all of us, at some point, need someone to believe in our worth. Because in the end, being rich is not about having billions in the bank, it's about having the courage to care about what really matters. Sometimes, it's not money that changes lives, but a few simple words spoken at the right time. And the one who offers those words discovers that true wealth lies in transforming someone. If this story touched your heart, write true wealth in the comments and subscribe for more heartwarming stories.